I treat this particular bill as censorship by compliance. Because you get impacted by this bill, you will choose not to do certain things to avoid being covered under this bill.
Isn't this just long overdue basic regulation keeping up with the times?
Someone sitting in Vancouver can also be censored here for speech that they have made in their country, which might be legal in their land.
What is ideal here? I mean, what is a good solution?
I would say the ideal situation is this bill gets scrapped. It applies only to traditional media and not to the internet, where anyone can publish and anyone can write, anyone can say what they want.
Hi, and welcome to episode 25 of the India Dialogue. I can't believe we made it to episode 25. Today, we're joined by a special guest. I'll introduce him in just a moment. Right now, I'm joined by Manu, who, as you know, is an advocate and a lawyer with his own law practice. He's a spokesperson for DMK. I'm Ruchir. I'm the CEO at Distributed Energy and the chair at School of Policy and Governance. Nikhil Pahwa is well known for his work as a journalist. He founded the Save the Internet campaign in the Internet Freedom Foundation. He's also one of the co-founders of the Internet Freedom Foundation, and right now runs MediaNama, which reports on technology policy in India. We are so happy to have you, Nikhil. Nikhil's presence should indicate that we're going to talk about the broadcast bill, but Manu will lay the foundation for what that means. Manu?
Fantastic. Thank you, Ruchir. Nikhil, fantastic to have you with us. We are truly, delighted that somebody with your kind of in-depth understanding will help us unpack the issues surrounding the broadcasting bill. It's been controversial. It's been interesting, to say the least, that this bill has come out now. But then it should not be a surprise to us, because the bill or its earlier predecessor draft emerged in November 2023. Of course, it was put on the back burner / cold storage because it was, moving into election year. But then, one of the first issues that I want to sort of address is also the fact that all of us did not make this enough of an election issue, right? Today, the amount of influence that digital content creators wield in terms of setting political narratives should have immediately meant this should have naturally been part of the election narrative, which it wasn't. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that, and then also help us understand and unpack the key issues between, or the key differences between the 2023 version, which is out in public domain. I think the ministry's website has a copy of it, and the 2024 version, which is, some people say, a bit hard to find and get hold of. But nevertheless, if you can tell us the differences between the two drafts or the two versions. And of course, perhaps then we can go into some of the issues that the bill tries to address. Firstly, and probably the most simplest way to look at this is long overdue reform. 1995, we had the cable television regulation bill. And at that time, I'm sure people were up in arms and wondering why the government was regulating the cable television, right? And then now 30 years later, almost 30 years later, we have OTT, we have digital, what the bill calls digital news broadcasters and online content creators, really. And is it not time to start some level of regulation? Of course, the degree of regulation, when it goes into censorship, chilling effect can be discussed, but shouldn't there be some basic broad regulation itself? So maybe let's start with those 3 points. Nikhil, I'll just quickly talk about it once more. First is, why do you think that this did not form part of the election discourse? Secondly, the differences between the two versions, the 2023 and the 2024 version. And third is, isn't this just long overdue basic regulation keeping up with the times?
So I'll address the third question first, Manu, because I think that's the basis and that's the most critical aspect here. Um, I don't think there is no regulation of online speech today in this country. If you think about it, the first version of the IT rules that came out was in 2011. And I remember because that's how I got involved in tech policy, because there was a move to hold blogs liable for comments made on blogs as intermediaries, right? We also had the famous Shreya Singhal case in 2014. We got the verdict 66A, and we got the verdict in 2015, where under 66A, someone was actually jailed. One person was jailed for asking why there's always a holiday when a politician dies. Another person was jailed because she liked that particular post, right? So I think even despite all of that, there are mechanisms under the IT Act to regulate speech, and anything that violate that it might be defamatory. It's already regulated under defamation law. So is this long overdue? I think to understand that we first need to understand what is long overdue, right? Um, this bill essentially converts almost every internet user with a significant following into a broadcaster, which means that if you tweet and you have a significant following and you tweet about news, and maybe because you have, let's say, more than 4 million views a month and you get advertising revenue share from Twitter, you would have to then comply with this regulation. You would need to register with the Indian government. You will need to create a grievance redressal officer position. You'll need to take complaints, resolve complaints. You will then also need to sign up with a self-regulatory organization paying an annual fees, and they have the rights to direct you to take down content or ask you to make changes, and that's happened in the recent past. Apart from that, a government advisory committee can actually, a broadcast advisory council set up by the government can also direct you to take down content. And if none of that works, the government can still also ask social media platforms to make sure you comply with those directions. Otherwise, they are liable. So, if you look at the scale and the scope of the impact that this regulation has on all of us, including, let's say, a blog that runs Google Ads, right? And if it might be talking about news, and if it's not talking about news, about entertainment, everyone gets covered. So, is it long overdue for us to have a regulation where millions of people in this country and millions of people globally will have to comply and register and join a regulatory organization, uh, etc., etc.? I don't think it's long overdue. I treat this particular bill as censorship by compliance. Because you get impacted by this bill, you will choose not to do certain things to avoid being covered under this bill, which means you might actually stop talking about news, as an example, or you might stop trying, you might reduce or delete your account if you reach a certain number of followers, because you might cross a threshold as an OTT broadcaster on the internet. So the scale and scope of censorship that we get with this bill, through compliance, self censorship, is just unparalleled, so to speak, in history. And I think we have to be very careful about um, this statement that online content creators are not regulated. And when you spoke about elections, you mentioned that uh, uh, why was this not a part of the election discourse? Actually, online content creators, online news channels, commentators were a key part of the election discourse. It's just that from a regulatory standpoint, none of the parties took it up, and this is despite the fact that a few in November 2023, this there was a draft version of the bill, and that draft version was actually just primarily focusing on streaming services and certain types of online news companies, maybe like the Quint or like us at MediaNama, and we would have come under this regulatory ambit. But I'm saying that the scale and the scope of this is just too vast, um, to the extent that if you're not doing news content, someone, let's say, like Virat Kohli, who might be tweeting about sports and entertainment, but also runs influencer campaigns on Instagram, uh, he would have to set up a content evaluation committee, and this is new under this bill, uh, which will have to have maybe a person from women and child welfare, which mentioned in the bill, or someone from the SC/ST community who need to certify the content before it goes up. So, uh, and then one other major change from the 2013 bill versus now, um, is the fact that this applies globally, which means Taylor Swift, before releasing songs, will have to get her content evaluated by a evaluation committee, which she will need to hire. Right, at maybe a Taylor Swift scale, she can do that. But there are so many travel bloggers and food bloggers who will have to do the same thing. That's why I feel this is censorship by via compliance burden.
Yeah, I think we'll come to censorship in a bit because there's plenty to talk about that, right? And especially the kind of onerous obligations that the bill brings about, and I'll hopefully ask you to take us through some of this, like meaning the grievance redressal and so on. But two questions to start you off. Firstly, will Mr. Narendra Modi be qualified as a digital news broadcaster? Because a lot of the time he talks about current affairs, right? So does that apply to somebody like him? And secondly, from a moral perspective, like doesn't great authority mean that you have also great responsibility today? Digital bloggers, I mean travel bloggers, food bloggers, um, culture bloggers, they are extremely influential. I mean, I think I'm pretty sure Mr. Rahul Gandhi definitely had a sit down with a food blogger during his campaign, right? I don't think we've seen that before in this country. I'm sure. I mean, and not this election, the previous election, Mr. Modi sat down with movie stars, right? So on and so forth. So shouldn't there be some yardstick of accountability, some yardstick of responsibility affixed to such people, because what they say is tremendously influential. And secondly, the fact is that me being a lawyer, I can tell you defamation cases take too long, or two, they're used in a manner that they're not supposed to, right, which is through criminal defamation. Now the problem is that you have that remedy only for defamation, but we have no remedy at all for fake news. At best, if there is something I can say which is not per se defamatory, but is just fake news, there is no legal remedy for that. So let me just put those two questions, and then maybe I'll ask Ruchir to come in after you've spoken.
So I think there are four questions, not two, but I'll go through them one by one. Number one, I think Mr. Modi will be covered under this bill because of the scale of the following that he has and the fact that he tweets both about news and politics. And let's not forget, for a politician, um, even sharing news could be seen as a systematic business activity to promote oneself as a politician. So it also lends itself to arbitrary implementation, but we'll get to that later. You mentioned that doesn't, with great power come great responsibility, and I completely agree with you on that. The thing is that people who have a louder mic can impact more people, can influence more people, and they should be more responsible in how they conduct themselves. What's and under the IT Act, under Section 69A, the government of India does have the right to censor such content as in when they want. So the power to cut off that mic already exists. If you remember the fact that there have been over 500 Chinese apps which have been banned in India,
True, true.
that came
And,
under Section
under public
69A.
security considerations, right?
That was actually surprisingly enough under data protection considerations, if I remember the press release correctly. And in fact, they weren't even mentioned as Chinese ads, but they were all censored under 69A. Now, let me turn this on its head. The problem with 69A and the way it operates is that there is zero transparency from the government. In fact, the bans on Chinese apps were the first instances ever that we've seen the government issue a press release on a 69A order. Otherwise, there is zero transparency, except if in Parliament someone asks about how many orders were given to block, right? So, if you think about who has the greatest power in this country, it is the government of India. And before we talk about accountability for other people with loud mics, let's also talk about accountability for the government of India, because it doesn't have any here. When it censors our speech, in fact, the government of India was trying to set up a fact checking unit to fact check reporting and tweeting and commentary on the government itself, giving itself the power to direct social media platforms to censor speech, right? In which case, the government was becoming an arbiter of truth about itself, which again, from a legal perspective and from a moral perspective, just doesn't make sense. Um, so I'm not saying that people who have larger platforms shouldn't be held accountable, but I see that as an enforcement problem. What we're seeing over here is a compliance burden that will mean that people who don't want to take on that compliance burden will not speak. It impacts legitimate speech as well, not just illegal speech. So if I am, and there's also the problem with this grievance redressal mechanism, because someone can basically just create, um, using just create a just flood with auto-generated complaints. Someone can file 100,000 complaints on my Google form where I'm accepting complaints for grievance redressal under this. And since you're a lawyer, you would know this. Under Section 79A in the Shreya Singhal judgment, what the Supreme Court had ruled was that platforms need to take down content only when there is actual knowledge of that complaint. And they defined actual knowledge as either a government order or a court order. Why was that happening? It was because people were sending frivolous complaints, and platforms not wanting to take on the liability of that complaint would just censor it. So, what you're doing over here is creating a higher compliance mechanism, but also trying to bypass existing regulation which the Supreme Court had contained by creating a censorship mechanism under grievance redressal. So, I would say that there is a yardstick of responsibility of compliance with Supreme Court orders for the government itself. Um, and I understand your point about defamation taking too long, but let's not forget that defamation in India is criminal. And in India, unfortunately, the process is the punishment, right? And so I think criminal defamation is enough of a deterrent. It's just that the complainants don't go to court regarding it. A lack of enforcement, um, I don't think, should be the reason to create more compliance burdens. We need to fix our enforcement. And so, if the government doesn't have the ability to contain illegal speech online, uh, I don't see why that compliance burden should shift to me, even if I'm doing legitimate speech. And this is not discriminating between legitimate and illegal speech. It is just putting the same compliance across the board for everyone, whether they're doing news or they're doing entertainment. And I can talk about the entertainment part separately because that has an even greater compliance burden. Um, one last thing I remember that you mentioned about fake news, right? Uh, there is already under the Election Commission rules against a self-regulatory code for elections, a significant amount of compliance that social media platforms are taking upon themselves. Has it reduced fake news? It probably has, especially the changes that WhatsApp made on its platform, for example, and the fact that social media platforms have a much larger team to deal with these issues, especially during elections. Um, has it completely eliminated fake news? It hasn't. Do you think that an increase of compliance is going to address fake news? I'd like to see the research on that and about how it won't have a impact on legit speech. The last thing I want to say is let's not forget that under this bill, the applicability is global, which means someone sitting in Vancouver can also be censored here for speech that they have made in their country, which might be legal in their land. Uh, you would probably have different people from different parts of the world who get covered under this bill, but they will not come to India. They will not register. They will not set up a grievance redressal mechanism. Uh, will they be censored from the get go? No. Who will be censored? The people that, or who will be forced to comply, and if they don't comply, they might get blocked, are the people that the government wants complying to this, right? So, a law that is arbitrary in its implementation by design should not be allowed to become a law.
Yeah, can I ask Nikhil? Sometimes at least my experience with the government on the technology front often is that a lot of the rule making is because they don't understand it well enough. Is this a like issue of malicious intent, or is this an issue of just they're not as well versed with the challenges of social media, and so they're making it more complex?
I think it's both. So let's look at what led to this bill coming into place, right? Um, if you would remember, somewhere around the Cambridge Analytica case, Ravi Shankar Prasad started talking about the impact of fake news. Let's not forget that most fake news that used to come out around that time was political speech, and it was coming from politicians and political parties, and they did nothing about it, right? But they tried to put the burden on the platform then. The other thing that happened was people started filing complaints about the content of OTT streaming shows, and they started filing court cases. So what streaming services did was they tried to come together and say we'll create a self-regulatory code so that there is no government regulation around this, and responsible members will comply with it. Most streaming services complied with it, but the government came out and said, "No, we want more. We want there to be another couple of compliance layers." And I won't go into too much detail because I looked at all of it live while it was happening, and you'll find most of that reporting on MediaNama. But eventually, the government in 2021 came out with the IT rules. The IT rules had two portions. One was which were not even considered in the IT Act. One was regulation of digital news publishers and news aggregators. Second was regulation of OTT streaming companies. They created a three-tier regulatory mechanism for each of these entities and put more compliance in. But the point is that what the law doesn't consider and doesn't allow, how can a rule create that? How can you, under due diligence guidelines, how can a rule create an entire regulatory structure? Now, unfortunately, the streaming services did not go to court on this because they were just reeling from the impact of the Allahabad High Court threatening to put together to issue a non or demand a non-bailable warrant um, for the content head of Amazon for a so-called Tandav. and that happened, I think, in Jan. And so the entire streaming services industry was scared about this, and so they didn't go to court. WhatsApp went to court to protect end-to-end encryption, and the many news publishers, including the News Minute, the News Laundry, um, Live Law, went to court to challenge the implications for news because they had actually placed censorship provisions, Section 69A provisions, on news entities, which means the government could directly censor news by digital news publishers, right? So different high courts have stayed that provision. One of the arguments is that these provisions are not backed by law. So this broadcast bill intends to address that issue, saying that address that argument in court, saying that it's not backed by law, by legitimizing the IT rules, which themselves have been a significant censorship provision. That was the last version of the broadcast bill. This version expands the scope substantially. Why? Because online news creators, including some operating from abroad, like Dhruv Rathi, had a lot of impact during these elections in terms of making people realize that there was some issues with how the government was doing things, right? And trying to hold the government to account. So in this version, the scope has been expanded to global because Dhruv is based in Germany. So I think we need to understand like how we got here to understand what the intent is. Now that's the malicious part of the intent. What is the, how do I say this politely? Um, where do they not get the internet? It's when they amend the law to target one person and it becomes applicable to the entire world. I mean, it isn't just applicable to our prime minister, it's also applicable to Donald Trump, effectively, right? It's applicable, the streaming services regulations are applicable to Taylor Swift. Will she set up a content evaluation committee? And remember, this bill says if you are not a news broadcaster, then and you do entertainment, whether you're a food blogger, travel blogger, or a singer, musician, and you have a certain scale, you will need to comply, um, and set up that content evaluation committee where SC, ST, women and child welfare folks will evaluate your content. So, can you imagine, like, I don't know how many millions are there on the internet? 4 million people on the internet. Even if 500,000 come under this ambit, can you imagine how many self-regulatory organizations will have to come up? How many people will have to set up a grievance redressal mechanism? So, in changing one definition in the bill, they made it globally applicable. But for me, making it applicable in India is just as unacceptable, because what happens is it puts Indians at a disadvantage compared to everyone else in the globe.
But let's talk about the global applicability, Nikhil, because I think this is truly India taking itself too seriously as a global superpower, right? And trying to essentially pass a law in the Indian Parliament, trying to regulate or bring within its purview digital content creators from pretty much the rest of the world, right? That's what it seems like. Now, I don't think it is at all practical. The Indian government or the Ministry of Information Electronics Technology, they don't have the wherewithal to actually monitor or understand or keep track of how many ever content. Assuming everybody in the world wants to register, right? I think we don't have the capability for that to begin with. But perhaps what they would say is, look, you're going to now make. I mean, India is a market, right? We have probably, I don't know what, 700, 800 million internet users. I don't know the exact number. Maybe Nikhil, you can correct me on that.
We have
But
about we have over 900 million internet connections, and I would guess
connection
about 700 million internet users at least. I
users,
mean,
right? So now you have this huge market. So if you are Taylor Swift and you want to, get a huge Instagram revenue or a Twitter revenue from Indian market, Indian online users, then you subscribe to Indian law or play by Indian Indian law and rules. So that's how they're going to say it. So how do you see that sort of global issue playing itself out? Firstly, and secondly, of course, now the problem is this, right? Which people who could have gone to court earlier on these issues haven't. But then, of course, as you rightly said, the IT rules have been challenged. But then, see, this is not a new problem. You rightly pointed out the 2011 IT rules have some pretty bad or pretty draconian provisions. Uh, they sort of mutated into the 2021 IT rules that you were just speaking about, and even those weren't seriously, I mean, of course they were challenged, but the courts have not, seriously sort of ruled on them. So now you have now this, right? So you have one building on top of another, and now you have something which could be quite sinister in its intent and its implementation. So how do you see this playing out in court? Of course, Shreya Singhal is an exceptional case in that sense. So, but the rule is rather, pro censorship, pro government sort of court rulings anyway.
So, two things. One, you've asked about global applicability, the other is about court. Let me address the global applicability first. We have a precedence in the Baba Ramdev case filed against Juggernaut Books, where Juggernaut Books was prevented from distributing the biography or the book that they had written on Baba Ramdev, not just within India but also globally and digitally, right? There was a similar precedence in New Zealand, I think, or Australia earlier this year. I think it was in New Zealand where a court had prevented certain content on Twitter, and Elon Musk actually pushed back and challenged it and said, "We will not take this down." But no one fought back on this on global censorship, and there have been instances of global censorship of content on social media platforms based on orders from the Indian government as well. So there is precedence for global censorship that we have seen. What we haven't seen uh, is global applicability of regulation. And you're right. Most people across the globe are not going to come to India and sign up and set up a content evaluation committee and sign up for a self-regulatory organization. Not happening for
Especially
most
because it
people.
will involve an OTP, Nikhil, which they won't be able to figure out.
I don't think you need an OTP for it, but they will not do it. But what will happen, like I mentioned earlier, was that when the government wants to go after someone, they will direct social media platforms to with an order specific to that individual account, asking for information on that account because the bill allows them to do that, and demanding compliance. So what is the platform going to do? It's going to go to the user and say, you need to comply with this in India, otherwise we will have to take action. And that action could be blocking it in India or not. So what you're doing is, instead of regulating this yourself, you are regulating via social media platforms. So this is almost like delegated enforcement, uh, in which case what's also happening is that the government, and remember, there are no reasonable restrictions to this particular issue. So it's not necessary. 19.2, which are reasonable restrictions to our free speech, do not govern these particular restrictions, as far as I understand, because it's compliance, right? And if you don't comply, you can be censored here. So the scale and the scope of the impact and the arbitrariness of the enforcement is what makes this untenable. How will this play out in court? Beats me, because it was those cases were filed in 2021. IT rules, I have been saying since then, are not legal, and you have a situation where the cases still haven't been adjudicated on. The only case there I think we have a verdict is the Kunal Kamra case, and that was for a separate set of updates for the IT rules. Even the so there are some instances, but not all. Um, and eventually, what will happen is many cases will be filed with respect to this bill also, and you might have a situation where the Supreme Court takes it up. But we haven't seen other significant cases, like, for example, the Pegasus case, uh, being taken up by the Supreme Court after the committee submitted its report. So I'm not sure when it comes to civil liberties, when the court will hear cases that are of extreme importance, like the one related to this bill or even Pegasus. But I hope it's soon.
Two questions in terms of the shape this takes. Nikhil, are you being consulted? They say they're consulting all the experts. Are they like who are they talking to? And the second
I'm
piece is, sorry, go ahead.
so I'm not I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. They'd probably be talking to lawyers, uh, but I don't. The people they're consulting, so to speak, are probably in companies, um, and they've so in the meetings that they've held, they've been very careful. They've only invited social media platforms and other platforms, and they've invited broadcasting associations and some broadcasters. They have not invited any news organization or even the Editors Guild, even though the Editors Guild has written to them. They've not invited Digipub, even though Digipub has written to them. So they're very conscious of keeping the news guys out of the discussions of this bill, uh, which for me is a worrying sign. Because also, as we saw with the Data Protection Act, um, by the time it was tabled in Parliament, it was very different from what we've seen prior to that. Some of it was good, some of it was terrible. Um, and it was passed without much debate. So honestly, our hope lies with Parliament. Hopefully, it will be sent to a standing committee. Hopefully, we'll buy time with more discussions. Hopefully, there'll be another public consultation, and hopefully, there'll be enough people giving them feedback saying this will not work. Because one of the things that the government seems to be relying on, as we've seen with this IT rules and now this law, is that uh, even before the courts can undo a bad law like the IT rules, the government passes a new law like this one might pass, right? So the government is faster at passing law than the court is at uh, effectively delegitimizing the law or taking it down or reading it down. It's almost like a race, to be honest, and it's exhausting for people who are challenging these attacks on our civil liberties to keep pushing back, especially with the attacks on civil society organizations that have been taking place. So the environment for our rights isn't that great in the country right now, and this is just another manifestation of it.
But I mean, what is ideal here? I mean, what is a good solution? Is it that we just enforce the laws better? Um, do we tone this proposal down? What is your ideal situation here?
And to add to Ruchi's question, is there a country which has done this better, or the EU, or somebody who's got a better handle on the balance between free speech and some regulation which is should be deemed as an essential necessary evil?
Uh, Honestly, I'm not so sure about who's done this well. But I don't know countries in which the kind of compliance that is required of broadcasters, even in television, and the kind of censorship that we see in television in India exists. As an example, I don't know if you watch TV anymore. I haven't watched it for a while. But I'm told that even words like breast, for example, are bleeped out on television in India, in on the movie channels, and the subtitles also don't carry that word, as if a part of the human anatomy is a bad word, right? Do we want that kind of a regime? I so don't. And I like crime shows, for example. I watch them all the time. Just finished watching Mirzapur last night, season 3, and I don't see that show being allowed on under a very stringent content evaluation committee because of the language, the gore, the violence, especially the violence against women. Right? It's depicting a cruel act done by a cruel person, but we don't know, like, a content evaluation committee will allow it or not. And if you talk to creators in the space, they'll talk about self-censorship, about shows that get canned, about ideas that never even make it to writing. um, because of the level of censorship, right? Streaming brought us that freedom. That's why we love streaming services and even Indian content on streaming services, because it's for grown-ups, not governed by a nanny state. I'll give you a small example related to this, and I say this quite often. In the 90s, there was a song um, that led to mobs going out on the street and lots of protests. It was a song called "Sexy, Sexy, Sexy Mujhe Log Bole." Do you remember this? They had to change it to "Baby, Baby, Baby Mujhe Log Bole." So in the 90s, we were a country where the word "sexy" led to mob action. Do you see that happening now? Can you even imagine that happening now? You don't, right? Because society evolves. Art pushes boundaries, music pushes boundaries. The idea behind rap is to push those boundaries and to be at times abusive and sharp and harsh to reflect the reality of existence. Mizapur, maybe it overblows it, but or maybe it blows it out of proportion, but it does that for life in UP in a sense, right? I've heard some stories about gundas in universities about 20 years ago, for example. Should we not allow art to reflect reality is the question here. Should there be a censor board for it? An ideal situation is that this bill gets scrapped. Uh, a hopeful situation that I have is that this act applies only to traditional broadcasters on television, and not to the internet, where all of us are equal, where a guy who starts a channel today, who starts maybe a WhatsApp channel today or starts a YouTube channel today, or someone who starts tweeting about something can actually build a career out of it. It gives us equal opportunity without that compliance burden, right? I wrote during the net neutrality campaign. I remember writing a piece for the Hindu comparing the internet to cable television, where I wrote that the internet is a space where you can have a billion TV channels. The moment you bring in compliance burdens, it goes back to traditional limited controlled situation, right? And the traditional players want that situation. Why? Because the internet challenges them. Because anyone can become a great creator. Um, and by the way, I wanted to address one point that I didn't address earlier. I just saw that in my notes about influencers and the impact that they've had. Now, if SEBI's come out with regulations on influencers. Do we need additional regulations? I don't know. On financial influencers, I think there's enough now. There are influencer guidelines that the MIB came out with a few over the last couple of years, along with the Advertising Standards Council of India. Those guidelines aren't being implemented as well. So there are regulations for influencers. We have ministers going and doing meetings, like doing podcasts and video shoots with influencers all the time. Um, Clearly, that's a media that people want to see, and that anyone can become one. We need to allow them the opportunity, because otherwise these kind of regulations will only favor the incumbents, people who've been there early when this regulatory burden wasn't there. Sorry, I know I deviated from that, but I would say the ideal situation is this bill gets scrapped. A more likely situation is it applies only to traditional media and not to the internet, where anyone can publish and anyone can write, anyone can say what they want.
I think the point you made, which I took away, which was a really good point, is it's effectively enforcement by adding compliance burden. You're basically uh, asking people, like you're getting people not to do things because you're adding burden on them. Because the reality of monitoring folks on the internet is really, really difficult. Like, how are you, unless you have a problem and something really upsets you, you're not really going to be able to go after and monitor everyone on the internet. You'll only target the people where it's convenient for you as a government. So, so it's been a really good breakdown. Manu, did you have any other questions?
No, I think you summarized it well, Ruchir, and it's really interesting to understand, the level of compliance burden that this bill creates. And I think Nikhil sort of summed it up very nicely when he said, people who got in early, free of those burdens, in a way, putting some more additional compliance burdens now would mean people getting in now really would find it difficult, right? It's the antithesis of encouraging startups, right? You'll only have the top 10 big companies really thrive. So I think that it makes a lot of sense from that point of view, from a point of view of free speech, from a point of view of level playing field. And of course, I think there's a certain way, there's a certain taste people have developed for the OTT content, as Nikhil put it. It's for grown-ups. It's for people who want to think beyond what the regular TV has to offer. I think it would be a great disservice to that industry. I think it would really sort of curb creativity by sort of adding all these things. So, and he's already made the point of art is one of the intended purposes of art is to push boundaries and whatnot, and this is actually quite unarty if you think of it that way. So yeah, I think all we want to sort of now think about is, assuming this goes to the floor of the Lok Sabha, then how can it be pushed to a select committee, if not a standing committee? But given the technical nature of this bill, more likely to be a select committee. And if it goes to a select committee, then how can various diverse voices and expert opinions add some level of nuance and understanding to this bill? I think it's I would like to see the bill scrapped to Nikhil, but I think that's expecting a lot. I think the best we can hope for is the bill to be sort of reshaped in a way that is more palatable and something that is more fair for everyone.
Can I just say one little thing? I mean, what's a bit worrying for me is the secrecy under which this bill has been released. I mentioned it earlier that the pages, the copy of the bill that's been given has been given to individual companies and industry bodies. It has across the diagonal uh, a watermark which includes a number, and each number corresponds to a particular company. I have never seen legislations being given to select few people in that manner, and they were asked to sign some pledge or something like that, where they said that they will not share it publicly. What I don't understand is, if the government is so confident of its legislation, why do they hide it? Why can't they just release it for everybody to see, for everyone to respond to? If they think it's a good bill, put it out in the public. And it also, as per our pre-legislation policy, they're supposed to do it.
Yeah. Feels undemocratic.
I think, I mean, there's been instances where copies of bills were handed to parliamentarians the morning that it was brought for discussion and passing. So I think we are hoping for a bit when we say pre-legislative drafting and consulting is something that should be par for the course. But Nikhil, thank you so much. I think you've added a great deal of value to us and our podcast, and just to understand this from somebody like you who clearly breathes internet day in and day out was truly illustrative, and it was a joy to listen to a lot of what you said. So thank you. Richard, do you want to
Yeah, Nikhil, normally we haven't briefed you. I didn't brief you earlier, but normally we end the conversation on a lighter note. We normally share, you can plug yourself, no problem, but we often just share something that people may not have heard, that is not related to news or politics usually. It may be related news, but something that ends the show on a lighter note. So I'll open today and give you some time to process if you want to share something in a little bit. Um, my have you heard? Apne suna kya? My have you heard today is like the stock markets are crumbling right now, and the source of it seems to be this really interesting situation out of Japan. Basically, obviously, like, so the markets have been overvalued since COVID anyway, but Japan has this specific situation where they lend you money at 0% because the interest rates in Japan have been at 0% for a while. And a lot of the smart investors, like finance world, loves these arbitrages. They basically borrow money in Japan at a very small interest rate, like say 0.25% or 0.4%. And then they will use that borrowed money to invest in US bonds or in the stock markets or in cryptocurrency and so on. Well, anyway, last week, the Japanese central bank increased the interest rate to 0.25%. And it did two things interestingly. One, it made the Japanese yen stronger because people were happy to bring their money back into Japan because now you can earn something on that money, which meant that the dollar crumbled against the Japanese yen. And so the folks who had borrowed money in yen and converted it into dollars, the dollars became far more expensive, and they were, in the technical term is a margin call. Basically, the loans were called back. And so suddenly all the folks who own the equities or the uh, like any other investment instrument outside Japan now had to sell. So the massive sell-off seems to have been triggered by this 0.25% increase by the Japanese central bank. It's interesting how interconnected we are. So that's my Have You Heard this week. Nikhil, do you have one right now?
Well, have you heard this week the song by Hanuman Kind called Big Dogs? I know it's not unrelated to this bill because he'll probably have to set up a compliance team eventually before releasing a song. But it's quite intense. He's in. It's shot in a pit where there's a car that's going around with him in it and some other folks in it, um, almost parallel to the ground. Great song, great music. Good to see an Indian rapper going global. Song called Big Dogs. I think everyone should hear it.
And and as you said, Nikhil, the idea behind rap is to push limits. So I think Hanuman kind has really done that with this song, and the visual appeal of the video is quite something. I'm going to do something which normally will take a great deal of effort for me to do, and it's very difficult for me to do because I'm a huge Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal fan. But you must give it to Novak Djokovic. Uh, I think a lot of people have held out from calling him the greatest ever just because of the kind of company he has kept the last 15 years, right? But most number of men's singles Grand Slam titles, 24. Most weeks as men's singles number one, 428 weeks. And apparently the best win-loss ratio for any men's singles player at 83.46%. Of course, topped it up this week with the Olympic, crown, like really the jewel in the crown, so to speak, right? And I mean, Nadal has won one Olympic gold. Andy Murray, who retired last week, has two. Federer has none, but still considered to be one of the best ever, right? And so it's really lovely to see Djokovic wrap up. He's not wrapped up completely, but he's in. I don't think he'll play the next Olympics. Just to be very clear, so good to see him wrap up his Olympic career at least with a gold. And it was a fantastic match. If not, you should watch the highlights. Thank you, Richard.
It said Novak. Somebody on Twitter said Novak Djokovic completed tennis. Anyway.
I would question about whether that should be Serena Williams instead, to be honest.
Oh, that's true. Fair enough. I agree with you. That's fair. Yeah, we do that all the time. Thank you all for joining us. Nikhil, thank you so much for what was extremely informative. We are super grateful
This was
for
a fun conversation, guys. Thank you.
and we normally, for anyone who has feedback for us, please email us at indiadialoguepodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter. Manu is at manuraj1983. I am Ruchir_P on Twitter. Nikhil is at NIXXIN, Nixon. We are at TID_podcast. That's India Dialogue _podcast on Twitter. On YouTube, we are on India Dialogue podcast channel. We look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks for your time.